this panel today on the legitimacy of power or the power of legitimacy. So, as you may have seen on the program description, the topic of this discussion will be the interplay between those two concepts, legitimacy and power. Many international relations students view actions of states and other international actors as a simple matter of power and interest. Others value international law as a constraint on power and arbiter of legitimacy in international affairs. Or perhaps international law itself is illegitimate and therefore not worthy of power, obedience, or respect. So this panel will examine the nature and the power of legitimacy, what makes international law legitimate or not, why legitimacy matters, whether power confers legitimacy or the other way around, and whether legitimacy should ever be a factor in the understanding or application of international law. So we have with us today Melissa Darkey, who is the William Gardner Hammond Professor of Law at Washington University in St. Louis School of Law, Monica Hakimi, who is the William S. Beinecke Professor of Law at Columbia Law School, and Mortimer Sellers, who is the Regents Professor of the University System of Maryland and the Director of the Center for International and Comparative Law at the University of Baltimore School of Law, and also the chair of the ABILA Group, Legitimacy and Fundamental Principles of International Law. So I think you should take some time following the order of the program to develop your thoughts, and then we will have a conversation among you and with the audience as well. So please, Melissa, why don't you start?
Okay, excellent. Thank you very much. Thank you for Tim Sellers for putting together this great program, Ioanna for moderating, and to all of you for showing up. Honestly, I'm thrilled to see this many faces in the room at 2:30 p.m. on the last day of the conference on a Saturday, a beautiful autumn Saturday. So thank you for coming and for engaging in this conversation with us. All right, so one of the ways one of the kinds of conversations we often have about the connection between legitimacy and power is, as the program cued us into, this conversation about this international relations conversation about when states comply with international law, right? When in fact they do. And we have three sorts of answers to this: the Hobbesian sort of answer that this is all about power, the Lockean sort of answer that this is all about interests, and the Kantian sort of answer that this is all about legitimacy. And so this sort of Kantian, in this Kantian sense, we have the literature on constructivism, where Thomas Frank said states are motivated to follow laws because there's something about those laws that exerts a compliance pull. The laws were passed in the right ways and so forth. And then, Jutta Bernay's more recent take on this and Stephen Toop's more recent take on this, that these legitimate norms are formed within a community of practice and so forth and so on. So I wanted to tell you about this conversation, to tell you that this conversation exists, but I'm going to take it in a little bit of a different direction. So if we're thinking about constructivism and this idea that laws are followed because of compliance pull, right? Because there's something that people perceive as legitimate about these laws. Let's think about the way that a legitimacy claim is a power claim, that you can make claims to legitimacy as a way of seizing power, right? And these claims are less expensive and more effective, perhaps, than using force. And you think here about Tom Tyler's work on procedural legitimacy. Tom Tyler said, people follow laws because they perceive them as having procedural legitimacy. And this is, in fact, more effective than deterrence through threats of punishment, right? So his work is mostly in the domestic criminal procedure context. But he says, you have these laws that are passed in ways that people perceive as procedurally legitimate. They're more likely to follow them, and they don't have to use the police power. So if you think about law, you think about legitimacy as a way to shore up a use of force in a way that doesn't require a police power, you can think of a lot of the legitimacy claims in international law as ways to try to shore up international law, to shore up international law's claims to power without needing a specific deterrent force. And you can see this in the Global Administrative Law Project, where we're thinking about all these legitimacy norms like transparency, participation, reason giving, rights of recourse or review as a way of giving these mechanisms of global governance legitimacy and thus power, right? Power, some sort of compliance pull. So in this conception, legitimacy is a discursive tool, right? It's a way to defend, shore up, recalibrate power. So how exactly is it doing this? What kinds of legitimacy claims might international law be making? Now, if you'll indulge me at 2:37 on a Saturday afternoon, to imagine, I'd like to give you a hypothetical. So imagine that AI solves climate change. Now, I understand that this is kind of an Ouroboros kind of hypothetical because, in fact, AI is creating climate change because all these data centers are using up too much energy and so forth. But imagine that AI solves climate change. AI provides this perfect plan by which we will stabilize the emissions in the atmosphere, stabilize the greenhouse gases, and this is a perfectly fair system in some conception. Maybe AI doesn't tell us why this is perfectly fair, but AI solves climate change. And the only requirement that's made is that governments have to submit to this plan, and then we will, all follow this AI plan, and climate change will be a thing of the past. Or we could substitute another actor. A major corporation that's developed AI solves climate change, right? Or Norway solves climate change. One actor, right? Any of these actors solves climate change, and everyone just has to consent to this exercise of authority. If you react at all as you're constructing this mental picture, if you react to the world that we're living in when AI solves climate change, what exactly is it that you're reacting to? What exactly feels, shall we say, illegitimate about that? So we have action on a problem that really affects us all. We have a results-oriented process, but maybe it's a process that didn't have input from political communities, right? It didn't have input from individuals who are going to be affected by AI's sense of justice and distributional fairness, for example. So what is it that feels uncomfortable about the solution? Is it how much input people have had into this process? If Norway, for instance, is solving climate change for all of us? On the other side, let's imagine a system where we have complete self-governance. And in a way, this is closest to the system we have now. It's what I call a pledging world order. It's a world order in which all climate commitments are made by pledge. Countries are pledging for themselves. Corporations are pledging for themselves. Cities are pledging for themselves. Municipalities, private actors of all kinds. Everyone makes their own pledge about what they commit to do about climate change. No one enforces this, and people are only committing for the constituencies that they have authority over, right? No one's committing for anyone else. No one's holding anyone else to account. So this is perfect representational democracy in a way, because individual communities at all levels are speaking for themselves about what they intend to do about climate change. Perhaps polar opposite to the AI example or the Norway example, right? Not to pick on Norway, sorry if we've got Norwegians here who take offense, but in any case, what is illegitimate about this? So I should add, the UNEP has just told us 2 days ago that we have made zero progress on climate change in the last year. Global emissions, in fact, grew by 1.3%. So we have made zero progress through this model. What is illegitimate about this model of solving climate change? It's kind of the exact opposite as the AI model, right? What's illegitimate is we're not solving the problem. We have plenty of people committing for themselves. We have no one speaking for anyone else. Countries are only speaking for themselves, committing, pledging for themselves. Companies are pledging for themselves. No one's holding anyone else to account, and yet we have zero progress. So both of these seem like bad outcomes, right? And this, to me, reads as the struggle between two competing values that we've seen flourishing over the past decades in global governance. We have a struggle between what I call the logic of representation, republicanism, self-determination, everyone deciding for themselves, the logic of representation on the one side. And then on the other side, the logic of result, or the logic of expediency, the logic of effectiveness, efficiency, function. The logic of participation is about, or makes a legitimacy claim that comes from these process values, that comes from people speaking for themselves, the legitimacy of participation. The other side, we have the legitimacy of result, of effectiveness, right? And each of these logics can point into different in different governance directions, right? The logic of representation can push us towards democracy, pluralism, polycentricity. The logic of result can lead us towards authoritarianism, technocracy, a globalism, a corporate autocracy. There's many models in either of these logics. But what we really have to resolve as internationalists, as people who are trying to solve problems through global governance, is how much of each of these do we want? Where's the balance between the logic of participation and the logic of result? The legitimacy that we get from a participatory system and the legitimacy of an effective system. And so I think that's really the struggle of international law and modern global governance. I don't know where I'm on my 10 minutes, but maybe that's a good place to stop.
Thank you. Monica?
Hi, everyone. Yeah, it's on. Hi, everyone. First of all, like MJ, I'm delighted to see so many of you in the room. And I should just say that what I'm going to say draws a bit on some of my work with Jacob Katz-Kogan, so you can blame him. No, but I want to give him credit where credit is due. And I guess I want to approach the question that the panel has been asked by crystallizing what I think is a very common view among international lawyers. And that is a view that international law, or law generally, works best when it works independently from and as a constraint on power. And so you see this even in, for example, our panel discussion, where it says, like, look, some value international law as a constraint of power. And then the thought is, if it doesn't serve as a constraint on power, maybe it's just irrelevant, a channel for power. So you have another reference in our paragraph. It's simply a matter of power and interest. It's just a channel for what would happen in its absence by those with sufficient power and interest. And then some say, well, actually even worse than that, if it doesn't constrain power and it's not just a channel for power, it actually gets corrupted by power and it's illegitimate by virtue of its cooperation with power. And so this is, you see in another reference in the panel, which is that perhaps international law is illegitimate because of its in some ways conflation with power. All three of these views, that it has to control power, if it's not just to be a channel for or corrupted by power, reflect, I think, a deeper understanding that law works and works best when it's independent from power. And I think it misses the extent to which that set of views, I think it misses the extent to which that, in fact, law works as a co-constitutive element of power, by which I mean that the two go hand in hand together. Effective law requires power, and effective power requires law. And so if to just make this concrete, we can take our present moment where the international legal and political order, the world order that we have inherited, is one that is highly legalized. It's an order in which the methods, the processes, the institutions of international law permeate virtually every facet of social, economic, political life. It is an order that is highly institutionalized and organized around by entities, international tribunals, courts, non-governmental organizations, other intergovernmental organizations that are themselves constituted by and focused on international law. It is an order in which trade and economic affairs were highly liberalized, so that we had cross-border transactions at a very, very high rate and an exponential growth in the global economy. It is an order in which the human individual was made central to the enterprise after years of being and to some extent still is, subservient to the interests of so-called sovereign states. And it is an order in which the state, as a unit of governance, has been stable. Not what happens within states necessarily, but the state as a unit of governance whose borders are defined and not to be taken by other states that have the power to do so. And it was an order in which the United States of America was extraordinarily powerful. And these two things are not, in my view, coincidental. These two things go hand in hand, because this was a world that the United States played an extraordinary and disproportionate share in building. It didn't build this alone. It didn't just channel its own interests through international law, although it did use international law to advance its interests. But it helped to build this system, and it helped to build this system in ways that I think international lawyers have really not paid attention to and are not currently grappling with. And this is not to say anything about all the violations that the United States committed, given all the arbitrary abuses of power, given all the failure to repair or remedy harms, all the failure of accountability, all of that, all of the criticisms, given, agree, all of that is true. And it is also true that the United States, at a deep structural level, helped to create the international legal and political order that is now in decay. And it did this in various ways. It did this by, for example, policing trade routes so that trade could occur on relatively even terms. Not perfectly even terms, but relatively even terms. It did this by funding international organizations disproportionately. Yes, it has the capacity to. Yes, it gets a lot out of it. It doesn't do this out of charity, but it nevertheless, pays a substantial part, for example, of the ICRC's budget. It pays a substantial part of the United Nations budget. It did this, for example, by taking seriously human rights, not always in ways that international lawyers want. So it did not, as we all know, it did not take seriously the process of incorporating international law domestically. As we all know, it has been hypocritical in its invocation of human rights across the world, but during this period when international law flourished and human rights law and the protection of the individual on the international stage in the form of human rights law, criminal law, and humanitarian law. During this period, it also happens to have been a period in which individual rights flourished in the United States, which of course is not to be taken for granted. And the United States, at a deep structural level, provides the architecture of security in the world. Not for everyone, everywhere, but I would say close to single-handedly, if not single-handedly, protects the borders of much of Europe, Australia, New Zealand, the Philippines, Japan, South Korea. On top of these, it assists with Israel. On top of these alliances in which it plays, again, a guerrilla-sized role, it sends special forces to more than 100 countries every year to help sustain their own security apparatuses. Yes, it helps those states then suppress their people with the money that we send over to them, but it also helps them sustain their own borders as entities that can continue to exist in the world. When Kuwait was overrun by Iraq, when Iraq, after our invasion, which of course debilitated it, then was further debilitated by the presence of ISIS, the United States sent its military there to sustain these entities as states free from territorial annexation. With Ukraine, it is the United States that is doing the lion's share to prevent its annexation. And US power is, for a variety of reasons, including all of the reasons that I mentioned that are sources of criticism, and the disproportionate power that the United States got from international law as it itself empowered international law, is in decline. Its power is changing and is evidently in decline. And as the United States' power declines, we can expect the legal and political order that it created or played a disproportionate share in creating also to be in decline. And that is what I think we are seeing right now. So we should, as international lawyers, take very seriously what is happening in Ukraine and in the Middle East, not just because we care about the individuals who are suffering grave injustices there, as they are, but also because those two conflicts are proxies for the future world in which we are going to live. Everyone knows it. International lawyers, for some reason, have a very hard time talking about it. My view is that they have a hard time talking about it. We have a hard time talking about it because we imagine that law ought to work independently from and by constraining power, and we don't take seriously the extent to which law actually requires power. And with the decline in US power, which many will celebrate for understandable reasons, one ought to ask oneself, what sources of power are going to fill that gap, and what kind of international law are they going to create? And I gotta tell you, when I look out at the world and I look at the alternative sources of power filling that gap, and that includes the alternative sources of power that might come from the United States, I don't feel good about the future. And I don't think international lawyers have, again, even begun to take seriously the need to attach their normative agendas to sources of power that can actually help realize those agendas and get things done on the stage. So I would submit to you that the thing that we should collectively be doing is taking very seriously the changes that we are seeing in the world, not just because we believe, as many of us do, understandably so, I believe this, the Palestinians ought to have a right to self-determination. The Ukrainians ought to have their right to self-determination. Yes, but that's not the only thing that we're fighting about right now. It's not even the start of what we're fighting about, in my view. And so this is just basically a call to action to take very, very seriously the current moment beyond the confines of these two conflicts, which have occupied an enormous amount of attention, rightly so, and to the broader set of dynamics that are going to fundamentally change the world in which we live.
Thank you.
Well, how wonderful it is, and a little bit daunting to follow two such excellent speakers who've made such interesting remarks already. Our topic today is the legitimacy of power and the power of legitimacy. This gets, or seems to me to get, to the very heart not only of international law, but of all law. What makes power legitimate? What makes the exercise of power legitimate? Legitimate in this sense, in the sense that we ought to respect it, defer to it. Any authority or law or any legal system, all law, every legal system claims to be legitimate. What would it take for this to be true in fact? That's the first question for this panel. What makes the exercise of power, the law itself, legitimate? And the second question concerns the power of legitimacy. Does being legitimate, does actually meeting the criteria of legitimacy confer power? And for international law, for the international legal system, I think this may be the more important question. All legal systems claim to be legitimate. Why? They claim to be legitimate because legitimacy, or at least the perception of legitimacy, greatly enhances the efficacy of the proposed legal rule and of the legal system as a whole. Legal systems claim to be legitimate because if they were legitimate, then we ought to respect them. We ought to defer to them. And obedience and respect is the aspiration of all legal systems, including international law. So power and the exercise of power may or may not be legitimate, but legitimacy, or at least the perception of legitimacy, confers power. We defer, and we ought to defer, to the legitimate exercise of power. And if an exercise of power, if a legal system, for example, is not legitimate, then we have no duty to obey it, and in some cases, we may have a duty to resist it. So everything that I've just said is true, I think, of all power and of every legal system, but it's particularly true of international law, because the coercive power of international law is often quite limited. And in some domestic legal systems, people may be accustomed to obedience, or even perhaps a false perception of legitimacy by the use of force. In other words, use of force may sustain a system that comes to have some kind of pseudo-legitimacy. This is less true of international law because there is less force, there is less reliable force. I think we obey and respect international law in large part because we believe that we ought to do so. And this belief arises from a perception of legitimacy. We believe that international law is legitimate and therefore ought to be obeyed. It is the power of legitimacy that makes this law effective, because law that is legitimate ought to be obeyed. So that brings us back to our first question about the legitimacy of power. What makes the exercise of power legitimate? What makes the claimed authority of a legal system legitimate? Legitimate in this context arises from serving and fulfilling, I mean, that's the meaning of legitimacy, to serve and fulfill the purpose of the enterprise. Legitimate law is law which serves the purposes for which the law exists. And the purposes that justify the law. And the declared purpose of law, I assert, is justice. And that may sound very general. It may sound like a very general statement, but I think it's essential. The purpose of international law is to establish, to secure, and to maintain a just world order under law. And a just world order requires a legal regime in which the law, as much as can be done, as much as possible, makes it possible for all those subject to its rule to live worthwhile and fulfilling lives. So now I've just given you a definition of justice. A legal order that promoted injustice, a legal order that promoted oppression or tyranny, in other words, an unjust legal system, would not be legitimate, and therefore would not be worthy of our obedience or respect. It would not deserve power. And therefore, its power, I assert, would be diminished. In other words, I think illegitimacy diminishes power just as legitimacy enhances power. The power would be diminished except to the extent that power could be maintained by force, which is hard to do, and particularly hard to do in the realm of international law. So the traditional definition of international law, as established by Grotius and Fattel, and repeated in the writings of Madison and Wheaton, was those rules of conduct which reason deduces as consonant to justice from the nature of the society existing among independent nations, with such modifications as may be established by general consent. Now, it's true that late 19th century German scholars vastly extended the role of consent in this concept. But behind the law still stands the underlying justification of the entire project, which is justice. So I'll report that there are a great many important and influential people throughout the world who are actively opposed to the project of international law because they think it is unjust and therefore illegitimate and not worthy of our obedience or our respect. John Bolton, for example, former United States ambassador to the United Nations, said to me that international law is like a snake, and he would like to drive the head of a nail through the snake's head so it could not bite anyone else. International law, in his eyes, is just a vehicle for protecting and advancing injustice. And indeed, I think that there are a lot of third world scholars who have agreed with him. They see international law as the construct of the powerful, deployed by the powerful to give a spurious luster of legitimacy to their exercise of raw power. Now, I don't agree with John Bolton, nor do I agree with Roberto Unger. I think that international law can exercise legitimate power to protect and support the powerless and to advance global justice in the international community. But to do so, in other words, for this to happen, assertors of the law must be much clearer than we often are. We must be much more willing to assert, much clearer in articulating the underlying principles that legitimate our enterprise, that make our enterprise of international law legitimate and justified. Too often, I think, we simply assert that international law mandates or requires some result, giving the statement perhaps some support from existing international law doctrine, but without explaining why anyone should defer to that existing doctrine. And I think that has the unfortunate result that I have just identified, that many, many people see international law as undesirable, something to be opposed, the project of elites and an unjust project. So if we can't articulate why the legal system as a whole is legitimate or justified, then I think we have little right to expect that anyone will defer to our assertions of legality. And so that's the challenge for international law. As for any authority that demands obedience, we must convince others as much as possible of the legitimacy of our power. And if we can do so, if we can persuade people of the legitimacy of our power, if in fact we can do so, if in fact our power and authority are legitimate, or if we can convince people that they are, then that very legitimacy will itself confer power. In other words, if we can persuade people that we're legitimate, that confers a certain power upon us. Legitimacy confers power because it deserves power. And that should be our mission as advocates of international legality. I think that's the mission that we should have as international lawyers. Thank you.
Thank you very much for emphasizing different aspects of legitimacy and power. So we heard a very powerful defense of substantive legitimacy by Tim. We also heard the need to align a normative agenda to a source of power, or to attach a normative agenda to a source of power for it to be effective. And we also had interesting reflections on the legitimacy of participation and the legitimacy of result. Do you have any comments towards one another before we...
Sure. Absolutely. Monica, I've been dying to ask you. I actually had a chance to read a paper that Monica wrote about this a couple weeks ago. So I've been dying for a couple weeks now to ask you. What exactly does it look like to take seriously the decline of US hegemony? Like so say we buy everything in your paper about how US power and international law have sort of co-constituted each other over time, and how this co-constitution is a necessary feature of international law, then what's next? And particularly, I was wondering if you could define what kind of power we need for this process of co-constitution with international law. Is it a power to coerce? Is it a power to decide? Is it a power to help people realize their capabilities in Sen's terminology? Is it economic power? And so could different world powers fulfill these different roles together and recreate something like we have in our current world with US hegemony? So I'm just curious, what is the next step once international lawyers have taken seriously the unraveling of the current order, and what kind of power structure do we need to shore up and co-constitute international law?
That's a great question. I would say that what comes next is being really clear-eyed about the situation that we confront, and serious about the compromises and trade-offs that we need to make. I would say that thank you. I would say that what's next is to be really clear-eyed about the problems that we confront and about the compromises and trade-offs that we need to make. And what we need, actually, in my view, is the reconstitution of a new world order, and that requires that requires trade-offs and compromises. So, for example, it would be great, I think, if states could agree that annexations of territory are off the table, that states once constituted have the right to exist in those territories. Those territories, needless to say, carry a lot of historical baggage and injustice. And yet, the lesson from history is that territorial conflicts are among the most brutal forms of conflict and the hardest to resolve once militarized. And that's what we're seeing in many parts of the world in which US power is being challenged by other states that want the United States out of its backyard. Again, understandable. But they want not only the United States out of its backyard, but also to take the territory that the United States is protecting of other states. So if we could get states, for example, to agree on that, and then to build a movement, like what else do we want the future world to look like? How can we those of us who believe in some emancipatory project for international law and for international politics, how can we create something that is not, if not better than what we are losing, that at least is not as bad as some of the options that are on the table. When MJ asked, and that of course depends on what's possible. It's not, you know, that requires a lot of like negotiation and conversation with people who are different from you, who have different priorities, who don't see the world exactly as you do, who want different things in a world as pluralistic as ours, and to be able to find points on which you're willing to say, okay, this we are willing to do, and this we are willing to put our power behind. And then MJ asked, what kind of power are we talking about? And I would say that we're talking about two forms of power simultaneously. The one is just capacity. And that is the form of power. It can come in the form of military power, economic power, human power, technological power, just the capacity actually to implement and get things done. And the other is, and that's often a social capacity, so that's also interrelated with the other, which is what I would call authority. And I guess in this respect, I disagree with Tim. He invited me to disagree, so I'm now doing it. I would disagree with Tim. I actually don't think, I think the obsession among international lawyers with obedience is an obsession that comes with a domestic model of law in which the idea is that the state tells you what the law is and your only job is to follow it and not cause disruption. I don't think that's a good model for domestic law, and I don't think it's a good model for international law. I think it's a model, actually, that conflates authority with coercion, because I don't think authority can do the same thing as coercion, which the obedience model assumes it can, and that is institute control of the individual. I think, which is what obedience is a stand-in for. I think authority does something different. I think authority empowers the person who has it, and that authority works best when it is passed around and shared among many people. So, for example, in the bureaucracy of a state, authority is not all centralized in the person who happens to run the bureaucracy. It is shared among many people. And you say, like, you go make this decision, you make this, you are empowered to make, I am empowering you to make, I'm not telling you what to do, I'm not insisting on your obedience. I am empowering you to make a decision, and that decision is in our shared interest in some ways. And then when you overstep, I will have mechanisms for saying, like, you no longer have my authority. Like, I'm holding you accountable for exceeding that which I, and this gets to MJ's point about representation, for exceeding that which I gave you. So it's authority is negotiable. It's a social construct. It's a normative construct. It's malleable. It's not like coercion that just gets hammered down by the arm of the state and insists on your compliance to hell or high water. And so I think what we need to do is we need to create a world in which the forms of capacity are connected with the forms of authority, so that those who have the capacity to do things are given authority and themselves give authority to one another to engage in social projects together. I don't think that's so crazy to imagine, because I think a lot of the world that is now falling apart is a world in which that happened. And I think if we were a little bit more honest about how international law has worked during this period, instead of obsessing about the ways in which it doesn't work, we might have seen that this is actually how it worked through the conjoining of capacity, what you might want to call material power, with authority, and the dispersal of authority across many, many institutions and among many, many different agents to try to do things in something like the common good, however unfair, however disproportionately shared the benefits of the system have been. I think I've sort of probably overstepped, so I won't ask other questions, but those are answers. Thank you, MJ, for asking those questions, because I think they help tease out my thoughts.
So thank you very much. Is this on? I think it is. Yes. Thank you very much, Monica, for disagreeing with me, because I asked her to. But now I'm going to disobey myself, because I agree with her and I agree with everyone. I agree with both of you. But I do want to stress the primacy in my mind of substantive legitimacy, because I think procedural legitimacy, substantive legitimacy, in my view, precedes procedural legitimacy. What justifies procedural legitimacy is its ability to give us the answer, to get us the solution, to secure the common good that Monica wants us to pursue. And I think the same thing is also true of power. Not that it necessarily precedes power, because power exists either way, but we value power. Power is itself legitimated. There's a service concept. If it's a service to substantive legitimacy is what makes us value power, and we confer power, I think, on those places. So the hegemony of the United States, it seems to me, was very real. I think you're absolutely correct in your observations about the current world order and its decline. But the decline is caused in very large part by the United States having departed from the principles that it used to, that it declared that it was embodying. So the post-Second World War order was, yes, largely a product of the United States, but it was a product of a very idealistic United States. I just came back from a year in Germany, and what everyone wanted me to talk about in Germany was what went wrong with the United States. Can you explain to us what happened to the United States of America? And they're trying desperately to find a new hegemon or some kind of new system, as you propose, because they can't trust us anymore. But that's our fault. And I think if we had retained a higher level of legitimacy ourselves, then our hegemony would be stronger than it is now. So I think there is an interaction between legitimacy and effectiveness. So on the one hand, yes, I mean, it's true that the United States, for example, after the Second World War, was in a unique position to help to establish a just world order. And it's also true that people turned to the United States and supported the United States in that project because they felt the United States was committed to that project. So it is I think what Monica was observing is that those who have power are going to be what's needed if you want to exercise power. So the United States had power, and people turned to the United States because of that power. But I can imagine a world. So we need the power, but we turn to the power that also matches the goals that we should have. And that's what we're looking for now. In the same way with courts. If you look at international courts or international tribunals, a good court attracts business. A bad court loses business. You go to the place where it's going to be well exercised. So I think, I don't know whether I'm expressing a more hopeful or less hopeful than you are. I mean,
well, can I ask a quick clarifying question?
Yeah, sure.
Okay, great. So, so taking this back to the capabilities approach, I really loved that you gave us a definition of justice, right? That something that allows people to live worthwhile and fulfilling lives. And I think you just partially answered the question I was going to ask you, which is you said substantive legitimacy over procedural legitimacy. So we want to fulfill the conditions for people to have worthwhile and fulfilling lives. So it sounds to me like you're more on the AI benign dictator solves the world problem side than you are on the pledging world order side of this balance, right? So you think that if someone is going to give people the conditions for Amartya Sen's capabilities, right, worthwhile and fulfilling lives, doesn't matter so much how we get there and whether everyone has voice in the process.
If it were true, I think, that there were, so it's, I don't really like your vocabulary, but I think we're saying the same thing. If it were true that we could miraculously create a perfect world by drinking the right soda pop, I would do it. But in fact, the reality is that's not how it works at all. And so a lot of the things that you described as indicia of procedural legitimacy are in fact necessary techniques for creating a just world order. So if you have a conversation that excludes any part of anybody really from the conversation, it's funny how it miraculously turns out, even with well-intentioned people, the result of the conversation favors the people who are included in the conversation. So if women, for example, are not part of the conversation, then for some reason things turn out badly for women. I don't know why that would be, but it is. And the same thing with any other excluded group. If nationalities, if entire continents, if entire racial groups are excluded, you'll get a poor result. So the procedural legitimacy arises from the effectiveness of the technique. And I think the things you were mentioning are all necessary techniques.
So you're saying procedural legitimacy is in service of the moral legitimacy, but it's not an independent good.
Yeah, I mean, on a small way, it could be because I think there's a value of feeling that you're expressed, you know, but yes, basically it's justified by its usefulness.
So Sen would say, right, that all of these are capabilities, right? One capability is the capacity to express yourself in decisions that affect you. And another capability is having different fundamental needs met, right? And so what I'm curious about is when you have to balance these capabilities, what kind of system do you end up with? And it sounds to me that you're saying, well, that the capabilities of voice are important to get us to the capability of justice, right? But that really there's not an independent value in co-constituting your political community.
I think that both of you referenced republicanism. I know that Monica did, but I think you did too. Well. And they both. So I'll give an ad for the Oxford Handbook of Republicanism, which is coming out this year. But I think that's the system. I mean, it's a Republican theory, but the Republican theory is based on what you were calling a common good conception of justice, so I think you emphasized the democratic aspects of republicanism, and you emphasize the common good aspect. And I think that the democratic aspects are derivative from the common good aspects. That's what, yeah.
Understood.
Ideally, we need both process, a process which will lead us to substantive legitimacy and a democratic process, preferably. Great, yes. Do we have anything else on this?
Well, we
topic?
have time for, oh, sorry.
Because I have a question. I have a question which takes us a little bit further from this point. Maybe I'll ask it now, and then we will open it up to everyone. We hosted Marty Konskeniemi at the University of Baltimore a few weeks ago, and he's working on a fascinating project. I'm sure you all know who he is. He has given us a fascinating analysis of the emergence of international law. And the project he's currently working on is that he thinks that the excessive reliance on the state-centric paradigm in international law has actually limited the imagination of international law scholars. So international law has been, to a great extent, defined by the discourse of the state as being a central entity, a central agent. And this is due to the academic discourse of German constitutional law scholars, constitutional law theorists, mostly legal positivists. So he thinks that maybe we need to move away from this concept in order to rethink and reimagine international law. So I have been working on the business and human rights area recently, and this is also a fascinating area of law where we see the paradigm of what a human right is changing. So traditionally, we understand human rights as limiting what governments can do, the liberties of the people. We now feel the need to expand our concept of human rights, because now we have other extremely powerful entities that we need to protect human beings against, multinational corporations. So this discourse that Marty Konskeniemi is now articulating, this critique of the state paradigm as the central entity in international law and in the concept of human rights, maybe is relevant in this area of business and human rights, where it's extremely important for us to rethink and come up also with a conceptual discourse in order to found those responsibilities and possibly also obligations that multinational corporations have to respect human rights in the developing world. So do you have any thoughts on this? Is Konskeniemi right in some other areas as well of international law that we need to reconsider?
Just to be provocative, and because Tim told me to disagree, I guess I'll say I don't think Konskeniemi is descriptively right, and I think normatively he's living in a land that is far removed from reality. So descriptively, I think it's not right that international lawyers have not paid enough attention to non-state actors. I think we've actually, over the past bit, spent a lot of time talking about corporations and non-state armed groups, and again, the individual, which is the central interest of human rights law. Now, we do so through the paradigm of the state, and on this I would actually agree with the substance of what Konskeniemi said, but disagree, unfortunately, with his positivist approach, because it is actually legal positivism that takes the state to be foundational to legal construction and international law. And so I myself think legal positivism is too limiting a frame, but not because we haven't taken the state seriously and we haven't taken other actors seriously enough, but because legal positivism paints a picture of international law that is itself highly state-centric and makes it harder to recognize all the ways in which international law, which doesn't get called international law by legal positivists, actually touches on actors who are not states. Normatively, I think we should be, in the present moment, extremely cautious about saying states no longer matter, because we don't have currently in the world realistic alternatives to the state as a unit of political organization for all of their problems, which are, again, extensive and significant. But what we see when we don't take the state seriously enough as a unit of governance is expropriation of property, annexations, colonization, breakup of states, collapse of states, subject with armed non-state groups taking over and oppressing the people even more than the states themselves did, sea level rise, dislocation, migration, mass migration. So when states break apart and fail to provide the public goods that states still are relied upon to provide for all of their problems, and that many fail to do, the people who live within those territories tend to suffer. And I think the project, rather than diminishing the importance of states, I think the project right now is to figure out how to help states sustain themselves in the face of what are very, very significant threats to their existence and sustenance and provision of goods for their people.
Do you want to go, Ish?
Yeah, so I mean, I agree with Monica. I guess I'm not supposed to be agreeing with people, but I agree with Monica that that international lawyers have really spent a lot of time in the last couple of decades thinking about non-state actors of various forms, and that this has really influenced this whole conversation about global governance, which is happening above, outside of, and with the state. But I think that what Koskinen might be getting at is that the state is, so that there are both failures of representation and failures of result, right, in our current system. And so we need to find a culprit, and we need to find a different way around these problems. And some of the culprits and some of the new solutions come from outside of the state, right? So we shouldn't be locked completely into the state frame as the only way to solve our problems. And I don't think we are, right? I think that I mentioned pledging earlier, and I want to call out my editor on the piece that I say, the Pledging World Order. If there's any merit to it, it's because it had the most spectacular editing known to man. So anyway, so the pledging framework, right, where people are pledging, like companies are pledging and states are pledging and municipalities are pledging and everything else, that's a framework where we are looking outside of these classic international legal frameworks to try to solve problems that the classic post-World War II codification processes of international lawmaking has not solved. Now, is pledging actually working? No, but it is a creative and innovative way that the international system is trying to solve problems above and around and beside the state as well. And maybe that didn't work, and maybe the next thing will work, or maybe that's too optimistic. So I think that the state was always a fairly arbitrary level of political organization. There were few enough states to have an international conversation and to form international law, and states were small enough that there was some sense that they could speak for their people, that there was some accountability to their populace. And so it has worked for us as a unit of political organization. But is it the only unit of political organization? Absolutely not. And there's ways besides the state that people always organize and represent themselves, including religious organizations, trade affiliations, communities of interest of all forms. And those are all active on the international stage alongside and in addition to states.
So Martti Koskiniemi is a very sweet and gentle man, but he does not think that international law has any coherence at all. And it turns out that positivists and nihilists are actually on the same team, and they're united in Martti. I like states. I think it's good. I think maybe that's what Monica was saying too. We need states. I'm in favor of states. But I don't like maximalist conceptions of sovereignty. I think maybe what Marty was talking about was more this very, very heavy conception of sovereignty that you sometimes hear, usually from very bad actors. So for me, the concept of the state is essential to the organization of an international community, but this very, very heavy sovereignty that some people are advocating for is what I think makes some people what makes people unhappy about the concept of states is this strong sovereignty thing. Yeah.
Excellent. Any thoughts, comments, questions from the audience? Yes, please.
Like talk about the role of international aid getting into the mix and then perhaps more coercive, force of money.
It's your turn.
Oh, okay. Yeah, please.
Yeah.
You also had your hand up, right? Yeah.
Oh, we want to answer your question. We're just disagreeing which of us would do it first. I thought it was your turn. Okay. Okay, we agree with you. We absolutely agree with you that aid is very coercive and powerful, and it can be a power for good. So in the same way that we talked about the hegemonic power of the United States, we should maybe start talking about the hegemonic power of Bill Gates or some other people who are heavy providers of aid. And that one way to get people to do things is with money. And I think that can be good and it can be bad. But a lot of this is in the hands of actors who may or may not be the actors we would wish to have that power.
I'll just add, if I may plug something. So in my capacity of editor-in-chief of the American Journal of International Law with Ingrid Brunk, we have a special issue coming out on reparations in international law in 2025. And we pursued the project because we thought like reparations, the claims for reparations are on the agenda now in a way that they're not, and we should take it seriously and we should see like what the options are, like have a conversation about it. And I would say that it very much, the demand for reparations is in tension with the idea, which is dominant in many critical circles, that aid is really just a form of coercion, because the demand for reparations is actually a demand for assistance or monetary and other forms. And so if one looks at that as just a further effort to dominate states that have historically been disenfranchised and are owed reparations, it makes the project of redistribution actually quite difficult. And so it's not my view that aid is necessarily coercive, although of course it comes with compromises and trade-offs like almost every decision in life does.
Yeah, please.
Thank you all very much. I was interested by the although if you did mention justice, you didn't hear the word moral until that's my question. Which had implications that if the system is unraveled, what takes place. But in being one of the challenges of distinguishing between legitimacy and power of international law, between international law and one state, that are perfectly fit for sovereign states that consent to something in the treaties and customary international law. But one of the dividing lines might be whether international law is reinforcing a status quo, like careful integrity of states, or trying to transcend that, therefore pierce it with, say, human rights law, where there's a moral consensus, or extend into the third bucket, where it's not doing either one of them, is therefore ineffective and challenged, forget limitation. Figure out which one. That if you lose hegemony in that kind of a chaotic system, what replaces it might be reduction, not legitimacy, but also power, then the non-state actor.
I think it's possible.
Do you want to respond?
Do you want to react, MJ?
Shall we comment?
We're persuaded.
You had a question. You had a question earlier? Yeah.
My question on this, think about the implications for your talk on for international lawyers and international legal scholarship. So you're drawn focus to disconnect between the sources of international legal law, the sources of power, and discussion of legal norms.
and gave examples such as the protection of trade routes by the United States. And so then there's a whole policy discussion about the seven fleets and the US Navy in the Pacific, the decline of its power and the reconfiguration of, for instance, the Indo-Pacific, how to bring countries together to be more connective. And all of this is then ultimately potentially going to uphold rules of international law. My point is that there are all of these intense discussions going on. Is the implication of what you're saying that legal scholarship should be more literate in these kinds of policy and strategic discussions, that it should be rigid towards them, or is there still an important distinction between talking about legitimate legal norms and these other strategic policy discussions about power, questions of deployment of Navy, assets, Pacific, etc.? Are these two distinct discussions?
I guess I would say they're not distinct. If part of what's happening in these conversations, which I think is what's happening, although I haven't spent enough time with the facts to know for sure, is that the arrangements are reconfiguring constellations of capacity and authority simultaneously. And they're not necessarily using the language of positive international law. So that form of authority might not be present, and international lawyers therefore might not see what they think they should be looking for when they look for international law, because it's not like the form of a treaty necessarily, although sometimes it is the form of a treaty, for example, a status of forces arrangement or other kind of agreement, which of course is an empowering move for the participants. You know, when, for example, the United States stations more forces in the Philippines, it is done with a treaty, and that treaty empowers the United States by expanding its military geographic scope and also empowers the Philippines simultaneously. And so I think that international lawyers who tend to look for positive law and obligations and compliance and obedience as indicators that international law is doing things tend to overlook these very, very important ways in which the legal system is actually changing in conjunction with the political system. And so I guess I would say almost certainly international lawyers should be better versed in those practices, although I haven't focused on them enough to know exactly to what extent law is being formed in a form that is different from, for example, positive law that most international lawyers would attend to.
Thanks for a great presentation, Monica. I want to challenge your conclusion the United States is in decline. We have the strongest economy in the world. We have a military force that's second to none. And mainly we have ideals in human rights and international law that have spread around the world. Probably 80% of international treaties were started in the United States, even those we didn't sign in the end. And countries like China that have, why do they have constitutions in the first place? Well, they're following the example we have set to have the oldest constitution in the world. It's good to have a constitution. Chinese constitution provides for free speech, public trials. It's meaningless, of course, but the ideal is out there. So, you know, overall, I think the United States is not only not in decline, but remains a source of inspiration for the rest of the world, and people still see us as a land of opportunity and freedom, pending the next election.
I guess that's an empirical question. It's not my sense of what's
America really in decline.
I think that one way in which America is undoubtedly in decline is that the legal order that gave it so much power is itself in decline, and it is a downward spiral. So as this legal order proves to be unsustainable, the U.S. power also becomes less. The U.S. has less power, and I think it becomes cyclical. I could be wrong, so we could see, but that is my understanding of how international law has enhanced U.S. power, even as U.S. power has enhanced international law. And as that law changes and becomes less available, so too does U.S. power. And I will just say, like, in support of my view is the fact that our Secretary of State seems to have made dozens of trips to the Middle East and persuaded no one to do anything. That seems to be within the realm of what the US government wants done there. And that's a reduction in capacity. That's an inability to get things done. It's a reduction in capacity and in power that I think the United States once had more of in that region.
You had a question? Yes, please. Yes.
My question for the panel is about what is the biggest threat to the legitimacy of international law, and what can we do to bolster that legitimacy? And to expand on that a little bit, Professor Sellers mentioned how those of us who believe that international law is legitimacy to convince others that international law is legitimate. So you're talking about the sociological legitimacy. Or have we failed to convince relevant audiences, such as states, the United States, to buy into this concept of international law? Have we failed on a normative level in terms of the institutions? Are the institutions, the ICC, the ICJ, projecting the wrong norms in international law, or is it the procedures? Is it procedural legitimacy that we're lacking in terms of how, for example, the preeminence of the Security Council fits into the statutes? And yeah, so given that, what can we do to bolster that legitimacy?
So great question. I guess I would endorse, sir, in the third row, Alan. I would endorse Alan's concept that there are multiple international laws, multiple kinds of international law. And it's easy to think the world is in crisis when we look at what's happening, the conflicts in Ukraine and in the Middle East. It's easy to think the world is in crisis when you look at our progress on climate change. But there's also lots of systems that are working quite well, right? Systems of coordination, systems of private law, systems of dispute resolution, and so forth. And so I think that I think we can't be too quick to wring our hands that the legitimacy of the whole system has gone to ruin. I wonder if we could kind of put all the different kinds of international law on a spectrum, right? And say we have, on the one hand, we have dispute resolution. We have dispute resolution kinds of international law. We have coordination kinds of international law. Then we have problem solving kinds of international law, tragedy of the commons, and so forth. Then we have fundamental norms kinds of international law. And I wonder if one of the things that this conversation is getting at in this difference between procedural and substantive legitimacy, or legitimacy of representation and legitimacy of results in this slightly different framing, is wherever you are on that spectrum, you have different needs of law, right? So when you're getting towards human rights and these fundamental norms, you need procedure, or you need legitimacy of result more than anything. You need legitimacy of substance. Whereas when you're farther on the other end towards coordination or disputes, you need, it doesn't really matter what the result is as much as it matters what the process is. So you need procedural, representational legitimacy more. And then maybe the problem that I'm thinking about in the climate change is kind of right in the middle, these problem solving, tragedy of the commons kinds of problems where you really do have that balance needed between substantive and process legitimacy. So that was kind of riffing off this question, and this was kind of riffing off your question, and potentially not a satisfying answer to either of them, but it was some thoughts.
Yes?
I'm fascinated by the
yeah. Oh.
and capacity, and I think after your most recent problem solving, the term that came to my mind was competence. To say, rule of law competence. Let me ask this question to connect this conversation with the comment about the United States. I would make an argument that the decline of competence in rule of law domestically is connected to the sort of crisis of American engagement in professional law. And I want to posit briefly in our panel this morning that from the United States, including the Supreme Court and repeal Roe, and the undermining starting cycles by the Supreme Court are just emblematic on the judicial side of that, in the operation of the law in the United States. But then the incompetence of the United States Congress over the last 20 years, ability to problem solve here at home, ability, for example, to regulate just basic competence of things that at the height of U.S. projection power in this international system and the ability to project legitimacy of these rules was this home base of problem solving. It allowed American exceptionalism and double standards and all these other things, but it was because we would say we have a judicial system that can take an 18th century constitution and make it relevant to the late 20th century. We have the capacity of Congress to take difficult pressures and technological change and regulate in ways that problem solve, right? That gets to MJ's point about like we could do the Clean Air Act and the Clean Water Act and use them as examples. We could pass the Americans with Disabilities Act and use it as the basis for international convention. We haven't done any of this in at least 2 decades domestically. So I'd love to get your impressions on this sort of connection between the crisis of liberal democracy at home with the crisis of legitimacy of the liberal international order.
Let's take one more question, please. Yes. So why don't you all respond and conclude also, make your concluding remarks. Yeah.
Yeah, so I'll go first since I finished the last 3. I guess Peggy's question can be the takeoff for my concluding remarks. Yes to everything you said. I mean, I think, so that's why I also agree with everything Monica said, that the loss of competence of the United States has had a tremendous impact on the world order. And most of my career as a lawyer has been working in countries that were in various ways trying to improve themselves, trying to improve as a rule of law entity, trying to figure out how to bring, how to decrease corruption, how to increase the rule of law. And all of the lessons that we learned in these other nations are applicable to the United States. We see all the same things happening. It's distressing. And that is seen by the entire world. So to the extent, just like any other organization that I've ever been involved in, it's remarkable how whoever is seen as the leader of that group conveys to the entire organization and the entire system their faults if they have them. And I think the United States has been exporting its faults to the whole world, and particularly lately. And so, it's distressing to see as an American, but it's also distressing for everyone who watches us. And particularly, the Europeans are distressed. So, and everywhere in the world, because it's been astonishing to me the extent to which people naively are inspired by the United States in all corners of the world. And they talk to you and you see people being heroic and citing us as an example. And I think you'll see less of that. And so I think your point is a very strong one. On the overall discussion, I mean, one of the things we're talking about perhaps is the relationship between, or the cross-fertilization between international relations scholarship, which is all about power, and international law, which is all about norms. And we're seeing the international relations people understanding the power of norms, and we're seeing international law people recognizing the power of power. But I am not that hopeful of the world collectively pulling itself together in the absence of the United States and creating a greater rule of law order. I think if we betray our ideals, it's not obvious that that other people are gonna step up. So I think one important function the American branch of the International Law Association could serve would be to try and encourage the United States to be loyal to what I would think of as our traditional values. And I think those values are embodied in international law. And so we have a strong position from which to make that assertion.
Okay, I'll just say thanks for the, I see we're sort of short on time, so thanks for all the comments, but especially these last two. In response to this question, I agree with what you said, Peggy, about the crisis of legitimacy in the United States. And actually, I'm reminded often of the Italian Marxist Gramsci, who speaks of a crisis of authority, when basically the elite structures no longer, for whatever mix of reasons, find enough support among those who buy into them. And I think we've seen that in the United States and in the world at large, and I think they're related for many of the same reasons that you talk about, but not exclusively. I mean, I think, quite frankly, people in the United States have reason to condemn the way in which the elites in this country have run the country. And so there's some, just as people in the world have reason to condemn the way in which the United States has managed the world. And so there's some reason for the crisis of authority. But then this gets to the question, well, does that give us, is that then reason for hope? And of course, it's always the case when you have a disruption in the power structures, which is what in my view, we're seeing, although I know not everyone agrees. But when you have a disruption in the power, it's always the case that you have the opportunity to create something better than what existed before. But one ought to ask the question of who is going to be in the role of creating that something better, and to see it as legitimate, to see whatever they create as more legitimate. And this just goes back to something I said earlier, which is, I think we are seeing a rise in authoritarianism in many parts of the world. We've seen a lot of countries in Africa turn more authoritarian. We have Russia, Iran, China, North Korea solidifying their alliance in ways that are intolerant of dissent internally and are not interested and at least in some of those cases are interested in suppressing populations in other territorial regions. So this is not a move toward, and of course we have authoritarian tendencies on the rise in many parts of the world, in many parts of the West as well, and so including the United States. And so these are not the constellation of factors that I think together produce a more emancipatory form of law. I think these are the kinds of factors that produce a more coercive form of law. And I think we should be worried about it, and we should be focused on that risk, even as we try to strive for something better.
So I would absolutely like to pick right up on where Monica left off, and perhaps just try to end this on a slightly more hopeful note. So you know, the really wonderful thing about moments of crisis is that there's something that comes after them. And I think the one thing that's really exciting about the moment we're in international law is we do see a lot of challenges to the post-war 20th century classic international lawmaking system where things were codified. They were between states. It's a power that was held together by first the US and Russia, and then just maybe us. And now everything's changing, right? We're seeing defections. We're seeing less respect for these classical principles. We're seeing failures in problem solving. We're seeing a lot of really challenging facts. But crises create space for new ideas, right? And crises create will to do something different and to do something better. And I see a lot of young attorneys in the room, and this is, and attorneys hold power to solve problems through law, and attorneys hold the discursive power of legitimacy claims as well. So really, these crises should provide a challenge to all of us in the room to imagine expansively about what new world orders could look like and how lawyers could go about trying to create them.
Thank you. This has been a fascinating conversation, and thank you also for your excellent questions.
Oh, if you want to sign up for, is it CLE at the back? Yeah, at the back we have there's a little sheet right underneath the clock. I just said suddenly I thought. Yes, yeah. Oh, yeah. He referred to you. He referred to that many times and to you and how helpful you are. He's, yeah. Yeah, well, he seems now, I mean, he seems to be somewhat launched. So that was very encouraging. Yeah. Yeah. But he has enough momentum so that things are happening. Yeah. Oh, good. Good. Well, we enjoyed having him there, but we were also, we were really hoping that